Professor Macfol, in the recent weeks, there have been much talk in the media about the military buildup on the Russian-Ukrainian border and the impending Russian invasion of Ukraine, between parentheses. Now, while Russia and the Ukrainian special services in a way deny this impending doom, at the same time on the Russian media, not the Russian media, all social media is full of photographs and videos of tank formations, of Russian heavy machinery building up on the border. My question is, in your opinion, as former US ambassador to the Russian Federation, why is Russia making this fuss on the border at this point in time?
Well, that's the $100 million question. And I don't have a great answer. I want to be very honest about that. And I don't know anybody. No, I don't know a Russian. I don't know an American. I don't know the head of the CIA. I don't know the head of President Biden also doesn't know the answer to your very excellent question. So that's the first thing I want to say. If I have to guess, I would say a couple of things. First, as somebody who has studied Putin, written about him for decades, and then dealt with him while I was in the government for 5 years as a former ambassador, but also when I worked at the White House for President Obama. I think it's important to underscore that he likes to keep his options open, that he likes unpredictability, and that just because he's planning for an invasion doesn't mean he'll follow through with that. Obviously, the evidence of the buildup is everybody knows that. It's very clear that that the capability is being amassed to do that, and much more capability, by the way, than earlier in the year, in the spring. This is serious from many sides, and those of us who studies Russia's military capabilities, I think it's important to remember Russia is a major conventional. Has a major conventional capability today. In my country, in the United States, I think there's an underestimation many times about Russian conventional capability. I think it is enormous. Putin has invested in modernizing those forces, and it's a very, very lethal force that sits on the Ukrainian border right now. But short of, in terms of speculation, about why he is doing it. One, he's doing it to get the attention of President Biden, and he achieved that, right? They just had their summit meeting yesterday, and Putin doesn't like to be ignored. And the Biden administration came in at the beginning of this year saying, we're not gonna pay any attention to Russia. We're gonna just focus on China. China. That was very clear, the signals that they were sending. And they just wanted to freeze in place problems in Europe, right? So you have frozen conflicts all over the former Soviet Union. They just wanted to freeze in place this problem. And I think Putin has reminded them that they need to deal with them. That's the first thing. Second, he would like to see a direct negotiation between Washington and Moscow over the fate of Ukraine. He has talked about this for many times. Sometimes it's referred to, as you know, Yalta 2.0, where the big powers get together and decide the fate of other powers in Europe. And to have that direct line to Biden, that's something he wants to do. I think we saw, at least from the readout that President Biden gave, that the Biden administration is not willing to do that, that they want to have a multilateral negotiation. We'll see where that goes, but I think there's an impasse there about multilateral versus bilateral. And then the third objective that Putin has asked for, and he made it very clear, is he wants a guarantee from NATO that NATO won't expand to Ukraine. And I think President Biden made very clear yesterday that that is not a guarantee that he will give, and nor does he have the authority to give that. So now we got to wait and see what Mr. Putin's reaction to the rejection of that offer, that ask will be.
But I mean, just to comment on your last point, I mean, personally, in my opinion, NATO needs the Ukraine as much as they need another Greece. I mean, that's just my point of view. Why would NATO threaten or suggest even that they might take Ukraine into the fold? Is it just to, in a way, mess with Putin? Or, I mean, I don't see any serious intentions of taking Ukraine into the fold. What do you think?
You're right. You're exactly right. And by the way, Vladimir Putin knows that too. This is a fabrication. This crisis of NATO, of Ukraine joining NATO, or of Ukraine attacking Donbass, this is a complete fabrication by Mr. Putin. There's no threat of NATO extending an invitation. They won't even extend a membership action plan to Ukraine, let alone membership. And by the way, Mr. Zelensky knows that, Mr. Biden knows it, Mr. Putin knows it, everybody knows it. And for me, that means that Putin is just creating this crisis out of thin air, I think mostly for domestic consumption inside Russia. But it is not a serious idea, and he knows it. I know that he knows it.
It's interesting that you mentioned Donbass. I can add to that Lugansk. See, as a matter of fact, everybody knows that the majority of the people living in Donbass and Lugansk have Russian passports now. In your opinion, would any sort of Ukrainian advance in Lugansk or Donbass give President Putin a pretext to launch a counterstrike against the Ukraine?
Well, in my opinion, no, because that's Ukrainian territory. And I just saw Mr. Ushakov saying, no country should tell us what we should do with our military forces inside our borders. He just said that. I'm paraphrasing, but I used to work with Mr. Ushakov, and I respect his point of view. Well, if that's true for Russia, why is it not true for Ukraine? Why is there one set of rules for Russia and they're not the same set of rules for Ukraine? So on principle, I reject that. But the second thing I want to say is more important. That is not going to happen. I will be shocked, and Mr. Biden will be shocked, and Mr. Burns, the director of our CIA, will be shocked if somehow Ukraine launches a military action against those with Russian passports. To me, that is, again, it's just a myth. It's a crisis that Putin is inventing. And you know, I mean, I could be wrong. I want to be clear. I don't have, you know, Mr. Zelensky is not asking me for military advice. I want to be clear about that. But to me, that seems like a very, very low probability event. And if I'm asked, I would say under no circumstances should Kiev do that. That would be falling right into a trap that Mr. Putin would be setting. And that trap reminds me of what happened in Georgia in 2008. And I hope that the government in Kiev will not fall into that trap.
Understood. It's funny, actually, that you should mention that, this being a trap, because President Putin announced very recently that the deployment of what can be considered game-changing ordnance in the Ukraine might force his hand. I mean, we've recently seen photos. I don't know if you have seen that.
Yes.
I can obviously send you a link. We've seen photos of Javelin rockets in the hands of Ukrainian soldiers. We've seen that in October, on the eve of the visit of the Pentagon chief Lloyd Austin to the Ukraine, we've seen that the US has delivered equipment for field hospitals. Is this an indication of some sort? Does this mean that an escalation is imminent? Or is this just the usual saber rattling?
Well, again, I just want to point out the hypocrisy in Mr. Putin's statements. He can put 150,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, and we're all supposed to say, well, that's Russia's territorial integrity. Everybody needs to relax. But somehow, if the Ukrainians set up a hospital that's a provocation to Russia? Give me a break. I'm sorry, but Russia is a mighty country. Russia is a powerful country. It's one of the most powerful countries in the world. And the idea that somehow a javelin missile, which cannot reach Moscow, by the way, I know that weapon system pretty well. The javelin missile cannot threaten Russia. The javelin missile cannot threaten the mighty Russian army located inside Russia. The javelin missile can only threaten Russian tanks if they roll into Ukraine. And I think that's a very important concept here. They are not designed, all those things that are being talked about, they are designed for defense, not offense. And again, maybe I'm naive, but I do not think the leaders in Kiev are so crazy that they would launch an attack against Russia. That's just ridiculous to me. And therefore, when I hear Putin talk about that, it sounds like he's looking for an excuse to invade Ukraine. And I hope the Russian people will understand it as that. And I would like to ask Russian people, not you personally, but why are Russians so complacent in this? Do you really want to go to war? Like, does Russia really need a major conventional war in Europe today with their Ukrainian neighbors? To me, if I were Russian, I would be asking myself, why am I just listening to the Kremlin talk about all of this stuff? I would like more scrutiny of what Putin is saying. And I say that as an American who didn't give enough scrutiny to my government back in 2003, when my government said, oh my goodness, American people, there's this, the Iraqis have weapons of mass destruction. And if we don't invade today, we're all going to blow up in a nuclear holocaust. And it turned out that that was a complete misreading of the facts on the ground inside Iraq that led to an incredible tragedy for my country, for my soldiers, for my people, let alone the tragedy for the Iraqi people. And so I would hope that Russians would give more scrutiny to these claims that their government is making, because I think that the circumstances could be very tragic for the Russian people. And I also think there's a real, hypocrisy in what Mr. Putin says about Ukraine. On the one hand, he just wrote a giant article saying that the Ukrainian people and the Russian people are all one nation. I don't know, was it Adnad Nazi? Is that what the phrase is? One nation. Nation gets translated different in English and Russian. So I want to make sure we get exactly the Russian word for it. So hold on. If you're one nation, why are you threatening to attack your nation, Mr. Putin? That's very strange to me. And so I hope that people might think a little harder about this and learn from tragic other cases of these kind of invented threats before you march off to support a war that is in nobody's interest.
Just to comment on the one nation, I'm Lebanese, and Lebanon is a neighbor of Syria, and the father of the current president of Syria was Hafiz Assad. And Hafiz Assad had the same saying. He said that Lebanon and Syria are one people in two countries. And that basically justified Assad Sr. to invade Lebanon and wreak havoc in Lebanon for more than 20 years.
Yes. That's a great that's a great parallel. And by the way, that was not good for... Go ahead.
I have to say that the position of the United States in regards to Assad Sr. and Lebanon was not very supportive of the Lebanese people.
Well, on this we agree. I agree entirely with you. That was not that was a mistake on our part for sure.
I mean, we know why that happened recently. I mean, in the first Iraq war, the U.S. needed the support of Assad Sr. Because of his conflict with Saddam Hussein. But nonetheless, that gave him free reign in Lebanon. And we are until now, the Lebanese are still suffering the consequences of that whole one people in two countries, or one nation in two countries.
I agree, but I completely agree. I'm not an expert on the Middle East, so I want to be careful here, but I would also say the Syrian people themselves has also lost when their elites talked about one nation. If you look at what Hezbollah is doing inside Syria today, if you look at what Russia is doing inside Syria today, the losers have been both the people of Lebanon, the citizens of Lebanon, and the Syrian citizens of Syria. And that's what I fear. A military war between Russia and Ukraine will be bad for Ukrainian citizens and Russian citizens together. And there will be no winners from that war.
On September of this year, you met with the Ukrainian President Zelensky while he was on a visit to Stanford. What sense did you get during your, however brief, conversation with him? And were any of the previously mentioned subjects approached with him?
Yes, I did have a chance to meet him. He gave a great speech here at Stanford, and we had time to talk. The first thing I would say is, as somebody who supports democratic institutions and democratic ideas without supporting particular candidates or particular ideologies, it was just a thrill for me to meet somebody who was elected in a free and fair election, and Mr. Poroshenko stepped down and he took over. That's an incredible feat. That's an incredible outcome, politics aside. And I hope that for Russia someday as well. And I hope it for my country as well too, because we've just, for the first time in a long time, we had a very difficult time handing over power from one president to another. So just to celebrate the fact that he did that, that was an amazing achievement, in my view, not just of Mr. Zelensky, but of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian elites that happened. Second, I was impressed with his realism about how to manage the Russian threat to Ukrainian democracy and how to try to repair U.S.-Ukrainian relations. You need to understand, and you probably do, but maybe not all your viewers do, that U.S.-Ukraine relations during the Trump era suffered their biggest blows ever, because U.S.-Ukrainian relations became politicized. And so much so that President Trump was impeached because of that, right? When he asked Zelensky to try to help him win re-election, that created a very difficult time for U.S.-Ukrainian relations. And we have not recovered from that, just so you know, because Mr. Trump plans to run again. And, some people in the Republican Party continue to talk about Hunter Biden and his alleged nefarious relations with Ukrainians. And so U.S.-Ukrainian relations are still, I would say, in a very difficult time. And I thought President Zelensky was very pragmatic in how he was trying to manage those relations. As you know, Zelensky is from the eastern part of Ukraine. Zelensky understands Russia pretty well. He made his career on Russian television. And I was very struck listening to him talk about his background and his understanding, just how, and I share his views, how tragic it is that there is this giant conflict between two peoples and two nations, that everybody's worse off. Like, is anybody in Lugansk better off today than they were in 2014 or Donbass? No. And I just heard in his voice, somebody that just wants to end the war and to get on to letting people live their lives in ways that they can improve their lives. And I sympathize with him greatly in that respect.
Well, that's understandable. But in a recent statement, he did not sound like he was a proponent of ending the war. He was actually saying that he will get the Crimea back into the Ukrainian fold. So that doesn't sound like someone who's actually, and here I'm playing the devil's advocate, that doesn't sound like someone who's a proponent of peace.
Well, I share his view on that. The annexation of Crimea was illegal. The entire world agrees with me. Even Beijing agrees with me on that. Annexation, we fought World War II over annexation. Millions, tens of millions of people died because leaders thought they could annex territory. and a return to a world where great powers just go around the world annexing territory because they want to, is a world that leads to World War III. So I believe, with almost every other country in the world, by the way, it's not just my view personally, that Crimea needs to be returned to Ukraine. It will be returned, it should be returned in a peaceful process. And when people shake their head and say, oh, Michael, you're naive, you don't know anything, how stupid can you be? That I hear that from my Russian friends all the time. I would just like to remind you that the Soviet Union also annexed lots of territories that my government at the time said were illegal. And it took many, many decades to right that wrong, but eventually that wrong was righted. And I think those that believe in rule of law and international agreements and the UN, United Nations as a whole, and signed up to those agreements, many agreements, right? Not just the UN Charter, but all of them, including Budapest in 1994. One day will right the wrongs that Putin did in 2014. I believe that too, but I do not believe it should be done through the use of force. And I've seen no evidence that Mr. Zelensky believes it should be done through the use of force.
How would you rate the recent video call between Biden and Putin?
Well, I don't like the fact that every time Putin threatens Ukraine, he gets a summit. I don't like that dynamic, but I do think if it's talk, or war, as Winston Churchill said at one time, it's better to talk. So I think it was good that they talked. I don't know what they actually talked about. Remember, I used to work at the White House, so I used to write these readouts. And what you write in the readout and what happened, samom, delе, are not always the same thing. Let's be clear about that. So I don't know what actually happened, but I do. I support what the readout was of what President Biden said. I think it's important for Putin to know what the economic consequences of a military intervention will be. I would have liked them to be more specific, just so you know, my personal view, because I want the Russian people also to know what the consequences will be. And for instance, if the Western powers will get together to kick out Russia from SWIFT, that will be, that'll affect you personally. That won't just affect Vladimir Putin. And I would, therefore, if that's one of the things they'll do, I would like it to be more explicit. But what he said publicly, I support.
NATO is moving troops, planes, fleets in training maneuvers and training exercises in a matter that could be considered provocative and aggressive, very close to Russian borders, land, air, and sea. What reaction is awaited from Russia? And should Russia also start rattling the saber?
Well, let's be clear. There's 150,000 Russian troops maneuvering, training on the Ukrainian border right now. Mr. Putin's already rattling the saber. That's очевидно for me. My own view is we have gone too far without a constructive dialogue about European security. On that, I actually agree with Vladimir Putin. We once had something called the CFE Treaty in place. It was one of the greatest treaties ever signed, reducing tensions in Europe. We have something called the Vienna document to create transparency about forces and weapons and soldiers and military exercises. And I think it would be a great initiative that we return to some dialogue about creating more transparency about what Russia is doing, what Belarus is doing, what military exercises, by the way, what Russia and China are doing in terms of joint military exercises, and conversely, more transparency about NATO military exercises. I think more transparency, more dialogue would be the first step. And eventually, hopefully, that could lead to another arms control regime that we would all reduce our arsenals as opposed to building them up. I firmly support that.